"We don't have a seat for you," my sister Natalie said with that perfect smile she'd been practicing since we were kids. I stood there in my navy blue dress at my own mother's wedding, watching 180 guests find their assigned tables while I had nowhere to go. The golden child had spoken, and Mom didn't even look up from her photographer when I asked where I was supposed to sit. "Figure it out yourself, I'm busy," she said, dismissing me like I was some distant acquaintance who'd crashed the party. So I did what I'd been doing my whole life. I made myself invisible, standing against the wall while everyone else belonged somewhere. When the photographer called for family photos, I stepped forward out of habit, only to hear Mom say with bright finality, "Yes, that's our family." And I realized I was looking at my replacement family, the one where the ICU nurse daughter didn't exist. 34 years of trying to earn a place at their table, and they'd finally made it clear there never was one. I smoothed down my dress, looked at my sister's satisfied smirk, and said the words that felt like freedom. "Thanks for making this so easy." Then I walked out of that reception hall and out of their lives. 3 months later, when Mom collapsed from diabetes she'd been hiding for years and needed someone who understood medical care that would cost $3,200 a month, guess whose number they called at 2 in the morning? Because I'd always been good enough to solve their problems, just never good enough to share their celebrations. The daughter they needed, but never the daughter they wanted. I had just been too hopeful, too persistent, too desperate for their approval to see it before now. Standing there in that reception hall watching everyone else settle into their assigned seats, while I remained invisible and unwanted, my mind drifted back to when this pattern first began. I was 7 years old, sitting at our kitchen table in our suburban Houston home, proudly showing Mom my report card. All A's, perfect attendance, a note from my teacher praising my reading level that was 3 grades ahead. Mom glanced at the report card briefly before turning her attention to 4-year-old Natalie, who was spinning around the kitchen in a pink tutu, her blonde curls bouncing with each turn. "Look at her," Mom had said to our neighbor Mrs. Peterson, who was visiting for coffee. "Isn't she just precious? She's going to be a little princess." Meanwhile, my perfect report card lay forgotten on the counter. That was the beginning of a pattern that would define the next 30 years of my life. Natalie was the golden child, the easy one, the one who lit up every room she entered with her bubbly personality and natural charm. I was the serious one, the responsible one, the one who got good grades and followed rules, but somehow never quite measured up to my sister's effortless appeal. By the time Natalie turned 6, Mom had enrolled her in beauty pageants. I remember sitting in uncomfortable folding chairs in hotel ballrooms, watching my sister glide across stages in elaborate gowns that cost more than our monthly grocery budget. Mom would beam with pride as Natalie won crown after crown, taking endless photos and posting them all over Facebook with captions about her beautiful, talented daughter. When I expressed interest in joining the academic decathlon team in middle school, Mom sighed and said it sounded boring. When Natalie wanted to try cheerleading, Mom immediately signed her up and bought her a complete wardrobe of practice gear, pom-poms, and hair accessories. The financial disparity became even more obvious as we got older. Natalie's closet overflowed with name-brand clothes from Abercrombie and American Eagle, while I shopped the clearance racks at Target with my own babysitting money. When Natalie wanted to go to cheerleading camp one summer, Mom found a way to pay the $800 fee. When I asked for help buying a graphing calculator for my advanced math class, she told me to save up for it myself. By 16, I was working 20 hours a week at a local diner, saving every penny for college, while also helping with household expenses that Mom somehow never asked Natalie to contribute to. Natalie spent her teenage years focused on her social life, dating and maintaining her position as one of the most popular girls at our high school. When it came time to choose colleges, I made the practical decision to pursue nursing. I knew I could complete the program in 4 years, start earning a decent salary immediately, and help support our family financially. The healthcare field was stable, respectable, and would give me the independence I craved. Mom's reaction was swift and predictable. "Why not become a doctor?" she asked with obvious disappointment. "You're smart enough. You could do anything you want." But when I explained that medical school would take 8 more years and cost a fortune we didn't have, she offered no solutions. When I asked for help with nursing school tuition, she claimed money was too tight. I ended up taking out student loans and working even more hours at the diner to cover my expenses. Meanwhile, Natalie decided she wanted to pursue social media marketing after high school. Mom immediately supported this decision, paying for expensive online courses and buying Natalie a professional camera lighting equipment and editing software that cost thousands of dollars. She's so creative and popular, Mom would tell anyone who would listen. She has such a natural eye for this sort of thing. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was killing myself working and studying to enter a profession that would actually help people and provide financial stability, while Mom poured money into Natalie's hobby that might or might not turn into a real career. But Natalie was the dreamer, the creative one, the daughter worth investing in. Throughout college, I barely heard from Mom unless she needed something. When I called to share news about making Dean's List or landing a competitive internship at Houston Methodist Hospital, her responses were always brief and distracted. But when Natalie posted a particularly successful Instagram campaign for a local boutique, Mom would call me specifically to tell me all about it, her voice bright with pride. Everything changed when Dad died suddenly of a heart attack in 2018. I was 29 working as a charge nurse in the ICU, and I immediately took time off to help Mom handle the funeral arrangements, insurance paperwork, and financial planning. I spent weeks organizing Dad's affairs, coordinating with lawyers and accountants, making sure Mom understood her Social Security benefits and life insurance options. Natalie, 26 at the time, and newly married to Jake, was too overwhelmed by grief to handle practical matters. Mom didn't expect her to step up because, as she put it, Natalie was too sensitive for that kind of thing. It fell to me to be the responsible one, the one who could handle difficult conversations with bureaucrats and make sense of complicated financial documents. But in the months that followed, as Mom adjusted to widowhood, she leaned entirely on Natalie for emotional support. They talked on the phone every day, sometimes for hours. They went shopping together, took weekend trips, shared inside jokes and memories that somehow never included me. I had handled all the practical aspects of Dad's death, but Natalie provided the comfort Mom actually wanted. When Mom started dating David 2 years later, Natalie was the first to know. She helped Mom pick out outfits for their dates, listened to every detail of their developing relationship, and eventually became Mom's closest confidant about wedding planning. I learned about the engagement through a Facebook post, found out about venue selections, through overheard phone conversations, and discovered most wedding details by accident. The pattern was so ingrained by then that I barely noticed it happening. Natalie was the daughter Mom actually wanted to spend time with, to confide in, to celebrate with. I was the daughter who could be counted on to handle emergencies and provide practical support, but I wasn't the daughter Mom enjoyed being around. Now, standing in this reception hall, where there literally wasn't a seat for me, I could see the progression clearly. 30 years of being the responsible one, the helpful one, the one who could be counted on but never quite celebrated. 30 years of wondering why my achievements felt invisible while Natalie's were spotlighted and praised. I had been so focused on proving my worth, on being the daughter they needed, that I had never stopped to notice I was never going to be the daughter they actually wanted. The realization hung over me like a heavy cloud as I continued standing awkwardly near the wall, watching the reception unfold around me. That's when I noticed my Aunt Janet and Uncle Tom huddled together near the bar, their heads tilted toward each other in the unmistakable posture of people having a concerned conversation. Janet, Mom's younger sister, kept glancing in my direction while whispering something to Tom. At 52, she had the same dark hair as Mom, but a softer demeanor, and right now her face was creased with worry. Tom, her husband of 28 years, followed her gaze toward me, and I saw his eyebrows furrow in confusion. I quickly looked away, pretending to study the elaborate floral centerpieces. The last thing I wanted was to create a scene or draw more attention to my humiliating situation. But I could feel their eyes on me, could sense their whispered conversation growing more animated. Other guests were beginning to notice too. I caught snippets of conversations as people passed by my wall post. "Where's the other daughter sitting?" I heard Mrs. Chen from Mom's book club ask her companion. "I thought Melissa had 2 girls," someone else murmured. The woman standing next to the gift table looked around the room searchingly. "I haven't seen Hannah since the ceremony. Is she feeling all right?" Each comment felt like a small knife. These people, family, friends, and distant relatives, had expected to see me at this wedding. They knew I existed, knew I was supposed to be here, but couldn't understand why I seemed to have vanished from the celebration. Meanwhile, Natalie was in her element. I watched her move through the reception like a social media butterfly, her phone constantly in her hand as she documented every moment of what she kept calling the perfect family wedding. She posed with Mom and David, with her children, with various relatives and family friends. Her Instagram stories were updating in real time, a curated highlight reel of happiness and celebration. What struck me most was how deliberately I was excluded from every single shot. When she took photos with other family members, she angled the camera so I wasn't visible in the background. When she captured wide shots of the reception, she somehow managed to avoid the corner where I stood. It wasn't accidental. This was intentional digital erasure, and she was executing it with the skill of someone who understood exactly how to control a narrative. David, bless his heart, seemed to sense something was wrong. I caught him looking around the room with a puzzled expression, his kind eyes searching for something he couldn't quite identify. At 62, he was a gentleman who had brought real happiness into Mom's life, but he was also stepping into family dynamics he didn't fully understand. During a lull in the photography, he approached Mom and said something I couldn't hear. She responded with a quick wave of her hand, the kind of dismissive gesture that said, "Don't worry about it," and David nodded uncertainly. He glanced in my direction once more, but when Mom pulled him toward another group of guests, he followed obediently. I realized then that David probably had no idea what was happening. To him, this might have seemed like a normal family gathering where people mingled freely. He wouldn't know that traditionally immediate family members sitting together posing for photos together were included in the formal celebrations. He was too new to our family dynamics to recognize the deliberate exclusion taking place right in front of him. As the evening progressed, I found myself studying these dynamics with a clarity I had never possessed before. It was like watching a play where I finally understood all the characters' motivations and relationships. Mom moved through the crowd accepting congratulations and compliments, but her attention consistently returned to Natalie and her grandchildren. She scooped up Emma for photos, laughed at Mason's silly faces beamed with pride as guests complimented her on her beautiful daughter and adorable grandchildren. When people asked about me, I noticed how quickly Mom redirected the conversation. "Oh, Hannah's around somewhere," she would say vaguely before changing the subject to something about Natalie's latest social media success or the children's activities. I had become a footnote in my own family's story. The most painful moment came during the formal family photos. The photographer, a professional who clearly knew his business, gathered everyone for the traditional shots that would go in the wedding album and be displayed in Mom and David's new home. First, he took photos of just Mom and David. Then he called for immediate family, and I watched Mom, Natalie, Jake, Emma, and Mason arrange themselves in a beautiful composition near the altar. I stood about 10 feet away, close enough to hear every word, but far enough away to make it clear I wasn't part of the group. The photographer adjusted their positions, checked his lighting, and took several shots. Then he stepped back and surveyed the scene with a professional eye. "Let me get a few more with the extended family," he said. "Is this everyone for the immediate family shots?" Mom didn't hesitate. "Yes, that's our family." The words hit me like a physical blow. Not "that's the immediate family," but "that's our family." Complete and final. No one was missing, no one else needed to be included. This was Mom's family, and I was not part of it. I noticed Uncle Tom's sharp intake of breath from across the room. Aunt Janet's hand flew to her mouth. Even some of the other guests seemed to sense something was amiss, glancing around as if wondering whether they had missed someone. But Mom stood there smiling serenely, while the photographer continued taking pictures of her complete family. Natalie looked radiant in her pink dress, Jake handsome in his navy suit, the children adorable in their formal wear. David, still adjusting to his new role, smiled warmly at the camera. They looked perfect together like a real family unit. And I remained outside the frame, outside the narrative, outside the definition of family that mattered. The photographer finished his shots and began packing up his equipment. The formal photos were done, the official record complete. When people looked back at this wedding in years to come, when they flipped through the album or scrolled through the digital gallery, they would see a beautiful family celebration. They would see Mom's happiness, David's devotion, Natalie's radiance, the children's joy. They would see a complete family. They just wouldn't see me. Standing there watching that perfect family portrait unfold without me, something shifted inside my chest. Not anger, not sadness, but something cleaner and more decisive. Clarity. I had spent enough time being invisible at my own mother's wedding. I smoothed down my navy dress and walked purposefully toward Mom, who was now holding court near the gift table with a group of her former teaching colleagues. She looked radiant in her ivory silk, laughing at something Mrs. Patterson had said about retirement. Her whole face was lit up with the kind of joy I hadn't seen from her in years. I waited for a pause in the conversation before stepping closer. "Mom, I need to speak with you for a moment." She glanced at me with mild irritation, the way someone might look at a server interrupting their dinner conversation. "What is it, Hannah? Can't you see I'm visiting with my friends?" The casual dismissal in her voice was so familiar, so automatic, that I almost stepped back out of habit. But something held me in place. "I'm leaving," I said simply. Mom's attention was already drifting back to her friends. "Okay, drive safe," she said without really looking at me. The words came out like a reflex, the kind of thing you say to anyone departing any gathering. There was no curiosity about why I was leaving early, no concern about whether something was wrong, no invitation to stay longer or suggestion that she would miss my presence. Just okay, drive safe, as if I were a neighbor who had stopped by briefly and was now heading home. That's when Natalie materialized beside us, having finished another round of Instagram documentation. She had clearly overheard our exchange because she was wearing that same satisfied smile from earlier. "Finally figured out where you belong," she said sweetly, her voice just loud enough for Mom's friends to hear. The cruelty of it took my breath away. Not just the words themselves, but the casual way she delivered them, like she was commenting on the weather or complimenting someone's dress. There was no heat in it, no anger, just cold satisfaction at seeing me leave. I looked at Mom, waiting for her to say something, anything that might indicate she disapproved of Natalie's comment or cared that I was being spoken to this way at her wedding. But Mom was already turning back to her conversation, effectively dismissing both of us from her attention. In that moment, 34 years of emotional neglect collapsed into a single point of absolute understanding. All those times I had made excuses for them, rationalized their behavior, convinced myself that I was being too sensitive or expecting too much. All those moments when I had wondered if I was imagining the preferential treatment, the casual dismissals, the way my achievements were overlooked while Natalie's were celebrated. I hadn't been imagining any of it. I looked directly at Natalie, my voice calm but steady. "Thanks for making this so clear." She blinked, perhaps expecting anger or tears or some kind of dramatic reaction she could later use to paint me as the problem. But I felt strangely peaceful, like I had finally solved a puzzle that had been confusing me for decades. I turned to walk away and noticed that some of the guests had heard our exchange. Mrs. Patterson looked uncomfortable, unsure whether to pretend she hadn't witnessed the interaction. A few other people seemed to be studying their champagne glasses with sudden interest, but I felt no embarrassment, no urge to explain or defend myself. I simply walked toward the exit with quiet dignity, my head held high. The valet brought my Honda Civic around quickly, and I tipped him $5 before sliding behind the wheel. As I pulled out of the parking lot of the Corinthian Event Center, I glanced back once at the elegant building where my family was continuing their celebration without me. The drive back to my apartment in the medical center area took about 25 minutes through Saturday evening traffic. I lived in a modest one-bedroom place near the hospital, chosen more for convenience than luxury. It was quiet and clean and entirely mine, which felt like exactly what I needed right now. I pulled into my assigned parking space and sat in the car for a moment, expecting the emotional crash to hit. I waited for the tears, the regret, the overwhelming sadness that should come after walking out of my mother's wedding. I waited to feel devastated or angry or lost. Instead, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Relief. Pure, clean, uncomplicated relief. I walked up to my second-floor apartment, kicked off my dress shoes, and hung my navy dress carefully in the closet. Then I sat on my couch in my comfortable pajamas and ordered Thai food from my favorite restaurant down the street. While I waited for the delivery, I found myself thinking about the past few hours with surprising detachment. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't analyzing what I could have done differently, wasn't wondering how I might have misunderstood the situation, wasn't crafting mental explanations that would make my family's behavior seem reasonable. Because there was nothing reasonable about what had happened today. I realized that some part of me had been preparing for this moment for years, maybe even decades. All those times I had felt like an outsider, all those moments when I had sensed that I didn't quite belong, all those occasions when I had wondered why my presence seemed to make everyone else slightly uncomfortable. I had been unconsciously gathering evidence, building a case, preparing myself for the inevitable conclusion that I wasn't actually wanted in this family. Today had simply provided the final, undeniable proof. My phone buzzed with a text from Jake of all people. "Hey, hope you're feeling okay." Kids were asking where Aunt Hannah went. I stared at the message for a long moment. Even Jake Natalie's husband had noticed something was wrong. Even the children had expected me to be there. But the people who mattered most, the ones whose opinion had shaped my entire sense of self-worth for 34 years, hadn't even noticed I was gone. I turned off my phone and settled in to eat my pad thai in peaceful silence. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I wasn't chasing anyone's approval, wasn't trying to prove my worth, wasn't hoping that tomorrow might bring the acknowledgement I had been seeking my entire life. I was simply done. The silence that followed was remarkable in its completeness. Sunday morning came and went without a single text message from Mom asking if I had gotten home safely or whether something had been wrong the night before. No call from Natalie wondering why I had left early. No voicemail from David expressing concern or confusion about my sudden departure. Nothing. I went about my usual Sunday routine, doing laundry and meal prep for the week ahead, half expecting my phone to buzz with some kind of follow-up from the wedding. But the quiet stretched on unbroken by any acknowledgement that anything unusual had happened. Monday morning arrived with my alarm at 5:30, and I fell back into my familiar rhythm at Houston Methodist Hospital. The ICU was busy, as always, filled with the controlled chaos of critical care medicine that had become second nature to me over the years. I checked on Mrs. Williams, who was recovering from emergency surgery-adjusted medication drips for Mr. Patterson, and coordinated with doctors about treatment plans for our sickest patients. It wasn't until I was updating charts during my lunch break that my supervisor, Marcus Thompson, stopped by the nurse's station. "You seem different today, Hannah," he said, settling into the chair beside my computer workstation. Marcus was 45, a former ICU nurse himself who had moved into administration but still understood the demands of our work better than most managers. Different, how I asked, genuinely curious, lighter somehow. Less stressed. "Did you have a good weekend?" I considered how to answer that question. Technically, I had attended my mother's wedding, been publicly humiliated, and walked out after realizing my family didn't consider me part of their unit. But I also felt more at peace than I had in years. "It was enlightening," I said finally. Marcus nodded knowingly. Sometimes family events can put things in perspective. He had no idea how accurate that statement was. The week continued in the same pattern. I worked my shifts, came home to my quiet apartment, and experienced a kind of calm I hadn't felt in years. No guilt about not calling Mom enough. No anxiety about whether I was measuring up to some invisible standard, no constant mental calculation of how to earn approval that apparently wasn't available to me anyway. It wasn't until Thursday evening that Aunt Janet finally reached out. Her text was simple and direct. "Hey, honey, are you okay? I noticed you left the wedding early and wanted to check on you." I appreciated her concern, but I wasn't ready to dive into the full story of what had happened. I typed back a careful response. "I'm fine, thanks for asking. Hope you enjoyed the rest of the celebration." She replied quickly. "It was beautiful. Your mom looked so happy. But I was worried when I didn't see you during the reception." I stared at her message for a long moment, wondering how to respond without creating family drama or putting Janet in an awkward position. I settled on something neutral. Just wasn't feeling well. Didn't want to make a scene. "Feel better, sweetie. Let me know if you need anything." That was the extent of our conversation, and I was grateful she didn't push for more details. Friday night curiosity finally got the better of me. I had been avoiding social media all week, partly because I wasn't sure I wanted to see the inevitable flood of wedding photos, and partly because I was enjoying the peace of not knowing what narrative was being constructed around the event. But 7 days of silence had me wondering whether anyone else had noticed what had happened, whether the exclusion had been as obvious to other people as it had felt to me. I opened Instagram and immediately saw that Natalie had posted extensively about the wedding. Her feed was a carefully curated celebration of the perfect family event. Professional quality photos showed her looking stunning in her pink dress, Mom radiant in her ivory silk, David handsome in his tuxedo, Emma and Mason adorable in their formal wear. Every image was magazine-worthy. The lighting was perfect, the compositions beautiful, the smiles genuine and joyful. It looked exactly like what a wedding should be, a celebration of love and family and new beginnings. I scrolled through dozens of photos, and slowly a cold realization crept over me. I wasn't in any of them. Not a single shot included me, not even accidentally in the background. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. I clicked on the photos to read the tags and captions and saw that Natalie had tagged everyone. Mom and David, obviously, but also Jake, Emma Mason, Aunt Janet, Uncle Tom, various cousins and family friends, even distant relatives I barely knew. People who had attended the wedding were identified and celebrated as part of the family celebration, everyone except me. The main wedding album post had over 200 likes and dozens of comments. Congratulations poured in from friends and family members praising the beautiful ceremony and happy couple. Several people commented on how gorgeous the family looked, how perfect everything appeared. But buried in the comments, I found something that made my stomach clench. "Where's your sister?" someone had asked. I thought Hannah would be in the family photos. Another comment asked, "Didn't Hannah make it to the wedding?" And another, "I was looking for Hannah in these pictures. Is she okay?" I scrolled down to find Natalie's response to these questions, and when I saw it, everything became crystal clear. Just immediate family in these photos, she had written back to multiple people who asked. Just immediate family. As if I wasn't immediate family. As if I wasn't Mom's daughter, wasn't Natalie's sister, wasn't part of the core unit that mattered enough to be included in the official record of this milestone event. I kept scrolling and found more evidence of the deliberate erasure. Natalie had posted stories throughout the wedding day, real-time updates that showed the ceremony, the reception, the dancing, the cake cutting. Hours of documentation that told the complete story of the celebration. I wasn't visible in any of it. Not because I hadn't been there, but because she had carefully, systematically edited me out of the narrative. Even in wide shots of the reception hall where I knew I had been standing, the camera angles were chosen to exclude the areas where I had been positioned. It was digital manipulation at its most sophisticated. Natalie had created a version of the wedding day where I simply didn't exist, where the family was complete and perfect without me, where no one would ever question whether someone was missing from the celebration. She had erased me so thoroughly that anyone looking at these photos would assume they were seeing the whole family, the complete story, the official record of who mattered. The comments from people asking about me were the only evidence that I had been expecting at all that anyone had noticed the absence. But even those were dismissed with Natalie's smooth explanation about immediate family, turning my exclusion into something that sounded reasonable and intentional. I closed Instagram and sat in my quiet apartment processing what I had discovered. This wasn't just about the wedding anymore. This was about the active construction of a family narrative that didn't include me, a carefully crafted story where I was not just unwanted but actually non-existent. Natalie had accomplished something remarkable in its cruelty. She had made me disappear. 3 months passed in blessed silence before my phone shattered the peace at 2 a.m. I was deep in sleep after a particularly challenging shift in the ICU when the buzzing jolted me awake. The caller ID showed Natalie's name, something I hadn't seen since before the wedding. My first instinct was to let it go to voicemail, but something about a call at this hour made me answer. Hannah Natalie's voice was high and panicked, barely recognizable. "You need to get to Memorial Hermann Hospital right now. Mom collapsed and they're saying it's really bad." I sat up in bed, my nursing training immediately kicking in despite my personal feelings. What exactly happened? I don't know, she was crying now. David found her unconscious in the bathroom around midnight. The paramedics said something about her blood sugar being dangerously high. They rushed her to the emergency room and now she's in the ICU and the doctors are using all these medical terms I don't understand. Despite everything that had happened between us, despite the wedding humiliation and the digital erasure, I found myself already reaching for my clothes. Which ICU? The medical ICU on the 4th floor. Hannah. I don't know what to do. You know about this medical stuff. Can you please just come? 20 minutes later, I was walking through the familiar halls of Memorial Hermann Hospital, a facility where I had done my clinical rotations during nursing school. The ICU here was similar to the one where I worked, filled with the steady beeping of monitors and the controlled urgency that characterized critical care. I found Natalie in the family waiting area, still in her pajamas with a jacket thrown over them. Her usual perfect composure was completely gone. Her hair was messy, her face streaked with tears, and she looked smaller, somehow younger and more vulnerable than I had seen her in years. When she saw me, she jumped up and rushed over. Thank God you're here. I've been trying to understand what the doctors are saying, but it's all so confusing. I could see David sitting in one of the uncomfortable chairs, looking shell-shocked and exhausted. At 62, he had probably never dealt with a medical emergency like this, and the stress was clearly overwhelming him. Tell me everything the doctors told you, I said to Natalie, switching into my professional mode. She pulled out her phone where she had been frantically taking notes. They said she has something called diabetic ketoacidosis. Her blood sugar was over 500 when the ambulance brought her in. They've got her on insulin and fluids, but they're worried about her kidneys and her heart. I nodded, understanding immediately how serious the situation was. DKA was life-threatening, especially in someone Mom's age. Has she been diabetic for a long time? That's just it, Natalie said, her voice breaking. We didn't even know she was diabetic. She never told us. The doctor said this doesn't just happen overnight, that she must have had diabetes for months or maybe even years. I felt a familiar mix of frustration and concern. This was exactly like Mom hiding health problems out of pride or stubbornness, refusing to acknowledge weakness or ask for help even when her life was at stake. Can I talk to her doctor? I asked. Dr. Martinez was a competent intensivist who knew his business. He explained that Mom had been in DKA for several hours before David found her, which meant her condition was quite serious. Her blood sugar was slowly coming down with insulin, but her kidneys had taken a hit, and there were early signs of cognitive impairment that might be related to the metabolic crisis. The concerning part, Dr. Martinez continued, is that we found evidence she's been struggling with diabetes management for quite some time. Her hemoglobin A1C is severely elevated, suggesting months of poor blood sugar control. She's also showing signs of diabetic complications, including some peripheral neuropathy and early retinal changes. How long will she need to be in the ICU? I asked. Probably another 3 to 5 days, depending on how she responds to treatment. But even after discharge, she's going to need intensive diabetes management. Daily blood sugar monitoring, strict medication compliance, dietary changes, regular endocrinology follow-up. This isn't something she can manage independently, especially given the cognitive effects we're seeing. After Dr. Martinez left, I sat with Natalie and David to explain what we had learned in terms they could understand. Mom's body had been essentially poisoning itself because her blood sugar had been uncontrolled for so long. The immediate crisis would resolve with proper treatment, but the underlying diabetes was going to require major lifestyle changes and ongoing medical supervision. So, what does that mean for when she comes home? David asked quietly. It means she needs help, I explained. Someone who understands diabetes management, who can make sure she takes her medications correctly, monitors her blood sugar, follows her diet, gets to her doctor appointments. Diabetes isn't something you can ignore or manage casually. Natalie looked at me with desperate hope. You could do that, right? You know all about this medical stuff. You could make sure she takes care of herself. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. After 3 months of complete silence, after being erased from the family narrative, after being told I wasn't immediate family, suddenly I was needed again. The insurance information David provided revealed another complication. Mom's Medicare would cover the hospital stay and basic diabetes supplies, but the level of home care she actually needed would cost about $3,200 a month. Medicare didn't cover round-the-clock supervision or intensive diabetes management unless she qualified for specific programs, which required extensive paperwork and waiting lists. "I can't afford that," David said quietly. "My police pension and her Social Security barely cover our normal expenses." Natalie was looking increasingly panicked as the financial reality set in. "Jake and I are already stretched thin with the mortgage and daycare costs. We can't take on another $3,000 a month." "But someone has to help her." Natalie continued, her voice rising with anxiety. "She can't just manage this on her own. The doctor said she could die if her blood sugar gets that high again." I observed this conversation with professional detachment, noting how quickly I had transformed from persona non grata to essential family member the moment medical expertise was needed. The same people who couldn't find a seat for me at the wedding were now looking at me like I was their salvation. The irony wasn't lost on me. Mom had hidden her diabetes for months, probably years, too proud to admit she needed help or medical care. She had risked her life rather than acknowledge vulnerability or dependence, and now that pride had created a crisis that required exactly the kind of professional knowledge she had always dismissed as less valuable than Natalie's social media success. I looked at my mother lying unconscious in the ICU bed, surrounded by machines and monitors, finally forced to accept the medical intervention she had been avoiding. For the first time in months, people were looking at me with respect and genuine need, recognizing that my nursing expertise was actually valuable. But all I felt was a strange emotional distance, like I was watching this crisis happen to someone else's family. By Tuesday morning, Mom was stable enough to be transferred out of the ICU to a regular medical floor. Her blood sugar had normalized with insulin therapy, and her kidney function was slowly improving. The immediate crisis was over, but Dr. Martinez made it clear that her discharge would require a comprehensive care plan. I was reviewing her medication list with the hospital pharmacist when Natalie arrived for visiting hours, looking more composed than she had during the emergency, but still carrying an undercurrent of anxiety. "So what's the plan when she goes home?" Natalie asked without preamble. "You'll be able to handle all this medical stuff, right?" I looked up from the discharge paperwork I was reviewing. "Handle what exactly?" Make sure she takes her medications correctly, checks her blood sugar, follows her diet. All the things the doctors said she needs to do. "You're the nurse." There was an assumption in her voice that irritated me immediately. "I'm an ICU nurse, Natalie. I take care of critically ill patients in a hospital setting. I'm not a home health aide or a diabetes educator. But you understand all this medical stuff better than the rest of us," she pressed. "And you live alone, so you have more flexibility to help." The logic was breathtaking in its selfishness. Because I didn't have a husband and children, my time was apparently less valuable, more available to be commandeered for family obligations. Before I could respond, David appeared in the doorway, looking exhausted. "The social worker wants to meet with us about discharge planning," he said. "She has some information about home care options." The meeting with Linda Chen, the hospital social worker, was enlightening in the worst possible way. She laid out Mom's care needs with professional efficiency: daily blood glucose monitoring, multiple medications that needed to be taken at specific times, dietary restrictions that required meal planning and preparation, regular exercise supervision, and frequent medical appointments with her primary care physician and endocrinologist, and a diabetes educator. The cost for professional home health services that could manage this level of care would be approximately $3,200 per month, Linda explained. "Medicare will cover some diabetes supplies and limited nursing visits, but not the daily supervision your mother requires." David's face went pale. $3,200 a month. That's more than our entire Social Security income. "There are some programs for low-income seniors," Linda continued, "but the waiting lists are extensive and the eligibility requirements are strict." "What about family members providing care?" Natalie asked quickly. "If someone in the family could handle the medical supervision, that would work, right?" Linda nodded carefully. "Family caregiving is certainly an option, but it requires significant commitment and training. Diabetes management isn't something you can learn overnight, and the consequences of mistakes can be life-threatening." After Linda left, Natalie turned to me with obvious expectation. So you could do this right. You already know about diabetes and medications and all that stuff. I felt that familiar pressure building the weight of automatic assumption that my life could be reorganized around family needs without consultation or consideration. Natalie, I work full-time. I have my own responsibilities, my own life. This isn't something I can just take on because I happen to be a nurse. But she's our mother, Natalie said, her voice taking on that wheedling tone I remembered from childhood when she wanted something. And you're single. You don't have kids to worry about. My marital status and reproductive choices were apparently relevant factors in determining my obligations to provide free healthcare services. That's when Mom's voice drifted from her hospital bed, weak, but carrying that familiar note of manipulation I knew so well. "Hannah, honey, could you come here?" I approached her bedside, noting that she looked frail and older than her 58 years. The diabetes had clearly been taking a toll for longer than anyone had realized. "I heard what you and Natalie were discussing," she said, her voice carefully modulated to sound both grateful and wounded. "I know this is a lot to ask, but I raised you girls. I sacrificed so much to give you both opportunities. Now when I need help the most, I hope I can count on my daughters." The guilt trip was expertly delivered, honed by decades of practice, but I found myself analyzing it with the same clinical detachment I used to assess patient symptoms. "Mom," I said carefully, "this isn't about willingness to help. It's about what kind of help is actually appropriate and sustainable." Her eyes filled with tears, a response that would have devastated me 6 months ago. "After everything I did for you now, you abandon me when I need you most." I glanced at Natalie, who was watching this performance with obvious approval. This was exactly what she had wanted, for Mom to apply emotional pressure that would make me comply with their expectations. The next day at work, I found myself discussing the situation with Dr. Amy Walsh during our lunch break. Amy was a geriatrician who often consulted on our ICU cases, and she had seen every variation of family dynamics around elder care. "They want you to provide $3,200 worth of professional services for free," she said bluntly after I explained the situation. "And they're using emotional manipulation to make you feel guilty for having boundaries. It's more complicated than that," I said, though, even as I spoke the words, I knew they weren't true. "Hannah, I've seen this pattern dozens of times. Family members with medical training get pressured to provide care that's way beyond reasonable expectations. They assume because you're a nurse you can handle anything medical, and because you're family, you should do it for free." Dr. Walsh leaned forward, her expression serious. "You know what happens to nurses who become unpaid caregivers for demanding family members? They burn out, their own health suffers, and they end up resenting everyone involved." That afternoon, Marcus Thompson stopped by the nurses' station where I was updating patient charts. "You've seemed distracted lately," he observed. "Everything is okay at home?" I found myself explaining the family situation, something I normally wouldn't have shared with my supervisor, but Marcus had always been supportive and I valued his perspective. He listened without interrupting, then sat back in his chair. "Hannah, you're one of our best nurses. Your patients depend on your skills and judgment. But if you take on this level of caregiving responsibility outside of work, it's going to affect your performance here." I hadn't considered that angle, but he was right. The stress and time commitment of managing Mom's complex medical needs would inevitably impact my ability to do my job effectively. "You need to think seriously about boundaries," Marcus continued. "Just because you have medical knowledge doesn't mean you're obligated to become your mother's unpaid healthcare provider." That evening, Natalie called me at home, her voice tight with stress. "I've been researching the costs of professional home care, and it's even worse than the social worker said. Quality agencies charge closer to $4,000 a month for the level of supervision Mom needs." She paused, clearly expecting me to volunteer to fill that gap. "Jake and I sat down and went through our budget," she continued. "Between our mortgage payment of $4,200 a month and daycare costs of $2,400, we're barely making ends meet on his salary. There's just no way we can afford professional care for Mom." The subtext was clear. Since they couldn't afford to pay for Mom's care, I was expected to provide it for free. "Natalie," I said carefully, "I understand this is financially difficult, but that doesn't automatically make it my responsibility." "But you're the nurse," she said, her voice rising with frustration. This is literally what you do for work, and Mom raised us sacrificed for us. Don't we owe her something? I felt the familiar weight of family obligation pressing down on me, the same pressure that had shaped my entire life. The expectation that my professional skills, my time, my life could be conscripted for family needs, without regard for my own well-being or boundaries. For the first time in my adult life, I was going to have to decide whether being a good daughter meant sacrificing myself for people who had spent decades making it clear I wasn't really part of their family. The pressure from Natalie and Mom continued building over the next few days, but something Dr. Walsh had said kept echoing in my mind. The assumption that I was legally obligated to provide care simply because I was family and had medical training. I decided I needed to understand exactly what my legal obligations actually were, rather than operating on guilt and assumptions. Thursday afternoon, I called the law office of Robert Kim, an elder care attorney, whose name I had gotten from the hospital social worker. Attorney Kim could see me Friday evening after his regular office hours, which worked perfectly with my hospital schedule. His office was in a modest building near the medical center, and his waiting room was filled with brochures about estate planning, Medicare, and elder care issues. Robert Kim was a soft-spoken man in his late 40s who specialized in exactly these kinds of family situations. After I explained the circumstances, he leaned back in his chair and nodded thoughtfully. "Let me start with the legal basics," he said. "Filial responsibility laws do exist in some states, including a few that require adult children to financially support indigent parents. However, Texas has minimal requirements in this area." He pulled out a legal reference book and showed me the relevant statutes. In Texas, filial responsibility only applies in very specific and extreme cases, typically involving wealthy adult children who completely abandon destitute parents. Even then, enforcement is rare and requires a court proceeding. In your mother's situation, he continued, there is absolutely no legal requirement for you to provide personal care, medical supervision, or financial support. Your mother has Medicare, Social Security, and a husband who can contribute to her care costs. The relief I felt was immediate and profound. So if I choose not to become her caregiver, I'm not breaking any laws or shirking legal duties. Correct. Adult children are not legally required to sacrifice their careers, financial stability, or well-being to provide care for parents regardless of family pressure or guilt tactics. Attorney Kim then explained other important legal concepts. Power of attorney required the explicit consent of both parties and could be revoked at any time. Medical decision-making authority couldn't be forced on family members. Most importantly, I had the right to remove myself from any medical contacts or emergency information if I chose. I have clients who've been guilted into providing care they couldn't afford emotionally or financially, he said. It usually ends badly for everyone involved. Setting clear boundaries from the beginning is much healthier. Can you help me remove myself from my mother's medical contacts? I asked. Absolutely. We can draft a letter to her physicians and the hospital stating that you're not responsible for medical decisions or emergency contact duties. It's completely within your rights. The paperwork took about an hour. Attorney Kim prepared formal documents removing me from Mom's emergency contacts, medical decision authority, and any financial responsibility for her care. The letters would go to Memorial Hermann Hospital, her primary care physician, and any other medical providers. Having this legal documentation felt like putting on armor. I was no longer operating on vague guilt and family pressure, but on clear legal boundaries that no one could argue with. Monday morning, I delivered copies of the legal documents to the hospital before Mom's scheduled discharge. The charge nurse accepted them without question and updated Mom's file immediately. When Natalie arrived for the discharge meeting, she immediately noticed something was different. "Why aren't you listed as the emergency contact anymore?" she asked, looking at the discharge paperwork with confusion. "I had my attorney remove me from all medical decision-making and emergency contact roles," I said calmly. Her face went white, then red with anger. "You had your attorney involved. What kind of person lawyers up against their own family? The kind of person who wants to understand their actual legal obligations instead of being manipulated by false guilt," I replied. "You're abandoning our mother when she's sick and vulnerable," Natalie hissed, her voice low enough that David couldn't hear from across the room. "I'm setting appropriate boundaries based on legal advice. There's a difference." Mom was discharged that afternoon to the house she shared with David in Sugarland. The discharge instructions were extensive: blood glucose testing 4 times daily, multiple medications at specific intervals, dietary restrictions, daily weight monitoring, and follow-up appointments with 3 different specialists within the next 2 weeks. David looked overwhelmed as the nurse reviewed the care requirements. "I'm not sure I can manage all this," he admitted quietly. "That's what professional home health services are for," I said. "Or you can hire a private aide who specializes in diabetes management." Natalie shot me a look of pure venom. "Some people actually care about family enough to help when it matters. Some people understand the difference between helping and being exploited," I replied evenly. Over the next week, the pressure intensified. Natalie called daily with updates about how difficult Mom's care was becoming, how David was struggling with the medical complexity, how expensive professional help was proving to be. "She can't remember to take her medications," Natalie complained during one call. "Her blood sugar was dangerously low yesterday because David gave her the wrong insulin dose. This is exactly why she needs someone with medical training to supervise her care." "Then hire a qualified professional," I said. "We can't afford $4,000 a month for professional care. You know we can't afford that. And I can't afford to quit my job to provide unpaid medical services," I countered. "Your financial constraints don't create obligations for me." The breaking point came when Mom called me directly, her voice weak and shaky. "Hannah, I'm scared. David doesn't understand my medications, and I'm worried about my blood sugar. I need someone who knows what they're doing to help me." For a moment, I felt the old familiar pull of guilt and responsibility. But then I remembered Attorney Kim's words about boundaries and my own professional obligations to my patients at the hospital. "Mom, I understand you're frightened, but what you need is professional diabetes education and qualified home care. I can give you the names of several agencies that specialize in exactly this kind of support." "But you're my daughter," she said, her voice breaking. "After everything I've done for you, don't I deserve your help when I need it most? You deserve appropriate medical care from qualified professionals," I said firmly. "What you don't deserve is to guilt me into providing services I'm not equipped to give outside of a hospital setting." "I can't believe you're doing this to me," she whispered. "I'm not doing anything to you, Mom. I'm maintaining professional and personal boundaries that protect both of us." After I hung up, I sat in my quiet apartment feeling something I hadn't experienced in months. Peace. Not the peace of avoiding conflict, but the peace of knowing I was making the right decision based on facts rather than manipulation. For the first time in my adult life, I was refusing to be guilted into sacrificing my well-being for people who had spent decades making it clear that my well-being didn't matter to them. The legal documentation in my filing cabinet gave me strength. I wasn't abandoning anyone. I was simply declining to provide professional medical services for free to people who had never valued my professional expertise until they needed to avoid paying for it. 2 weeks after Mom's discharge, I received an unexpected phone call at work from Uncle Tom. We had never been particularly close, but he had always been the quieter, more thoughtful member of the extended family. "Hannah, I hope you don't mind me calling you at the hospital," he said, his voice careful and measured. "I was wondering if we could meet for coffee sometime. There are some things about our family that I think you should know." Something in his tone made me pay attention. Uncle Tom wasn't the type for casual social calls or family gossip. If he wanted to meet, it was for a serious reason. We arranged to meet Saturday afternoon at a small cafe near Rice University, away from the usual family hangouts where we might run into relatives. When I arrived, Tom was already there, looking older than his 55 years and carrying a manila folder. "Thank you for coming," he said, as I sat down across from him. "I've been wrestling with whether to have this conversation for weeks, but after hearing about what's happening with your mother's health situation, I decided you needed to know the truth about our family history." He opened the folder and pulled out some old photographs. "I want to tell you about your grandmother, your mother's mother. Her name was Rosa, and she developed diabetes in the early 1990s when she was about 68 years old." I looked at the faded photographs of a woman I barely remembered. Grandma Rosa had died when I was in middle school, and we had rarely visited her during my childhood. "Your grandmother needed intensive care during the last 5 years of her life," Tom continued. "Diabetes management wasn't as advanced then as it is now, but she still needed daily help with medications, blood sugar monitoring, and medical appointments. Tom's expression grew darker. Your mother was in her late 30s then, raising you and Natalie. She was completely focused on your family and had no interest in helping with her mother's care. She always favored Janet, your aunt, and assumed Janet would handle everything. But Janet was dealing with her own young children and couldn't take on full-time caregiving. I felt a chill as I realized where this story was heading. So it fell to me, Tom said quietly. I was the responsible one, the one who was supposed to sacrifice everything for family obligations. It sounds familiar. The parallel was striking and disturbing. Tom continued his story, explaining how he had spent 5 years managing Grandma Rosa's complex medical needs while working full-time as a high school teacher. He had used his modest salary to pay for her medications and medical supplies that Medicare didn't cover. But it wasn't enough, he said, his voice heavy with old pain. I couldn't afford the level of professional care she really needed. She ended up in a substandard nursing home because it was all I could afford on a teacher's salary. She died there in 1997, and I've carried the guilt ever since, wondering if I could have done more. Tom looked directly at me. Your mother visited her own mother exactly 3 times during those final 5 years. 3 times. She was too busy with her own life, too focused on raising her golden child, Natalie, to be bothered with caregiving duties. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Mom had abandoned her own mother's care, leaving Tom to handle everything alone, and now she was expecting me to provide the same level of sacrifice she had refused to give. It gets worse, Tom said, pulling out more documents from his folder. After your grandmother died, your mother inherited half of the small estate. She used that money to pay for Natalie's cheerleading expenses and pageant fees. The money that could have paid for better care went to fund your sister's activities. I stared at the inheritance documents, seeing the exact same pattern playing out across generations. The responsible child sacrificed everything, while the favored child was protected and invested in. Tom leaned forward, his voice becoming more intense. Hannah, your mother is repeating the exact same pattern with you that she used with me 30 years ago. She's expecting you to sacrifice your career, your financial stability, and your well-being to provide care she's not willing to pay for, just like she expected me to sacrifice everything for her mother. But there's something else you need to know, he continued. Something about the wedding that I think was deliberately planned. Tom pulled out his phone and showed me a text message thread from several months before the wedding. It was a conversation between him and Janet about the wedding planning. Look at this message from March, Tom said, pointing to a specific text. Janet asked your mother about your role in the wedding, whether you would be maid of honor or have any special responsibilities. Your mother's response was very telling. I read the message from Mom to Janet. Hannah doesn't need a special role. This day is about celebrating the family that matters most to me. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. This wasn't a last-minute oversight or wedding planning mistake. Mom had deliberately planned to minimize my presence at her wedding. Tom continued scrolling through the messages. And here in April, when Janet suggested that maybe you and Natalie could both give speeches at the reception, your mother shut it down immediately. She said Natalie would represent the family and that was enough. I felt sick as I realized the level of calculation involved. The missing seat, the exclusion from photos, the digital erasure, it had all been planned months in advance. Tom closed his phone and looked at me with something approaching anger. Your mother deliberately excluded you from her wedding as a test, Hannah. She wanted to see if you would still come running when she needed medical help, even after being publicly humiliated. It was a power play, he continued. She was asserting dominance, making sure you understood your place in the family hierarchy. You're useful when she needs practical help, but you're not worthy of celebration or inclusion in the important moments. The pattern was suddenly crystal clear. I was the family scapegoat, just as Tom had been 30 years earlier, expected to provide sacrifice and service while being excluded from love and recognition. You're breaking a cycle, Tom said firmly. What you're doing by setting boundaries, by refusing to be manipulated into providing free caregiving, you're breaking a generational pattern of exploitation. Tom reached across the table and squeezed my hand. I should have stood up to your mother 30 years ago when she abandoned her own mother's care. I should have refused to be the sole caregiver, should have demanded she take responsibility. Instead, I enabled her selfishness, and it cost your grandmother proper care. Don't make the same mistake I did, he said urgently. Don't sacrifice yourself for people who have made it clear you're only valuable when they need something from you. As I drove home from that coffee meeting, I felt a profound shift in my understanding of my family dynamics. This wasn't about me being difficult or ungrateful. This was about breaking a toxic pattern that had damaged multiple generations. Mom had tested my loyalty by excluding me from her wedding, expecting that I would still come running when she needed medical expertise. She had calculated that my desperation for family acceptance would override my self-respect, but for the first time in my life, I was going to prove her wrong. The pattern stopped with me. The fallout from my refusal to provide free caregiving services began almost immediately. Within 2 weeks of Mom's discharge, Aunt Janet called with updates that painted a picture of escalating chaos. "Your mother had another blood sugar crisis last week," Janet reported during our brief conversation. "David found her confused and shaky, and they had to call an ambulance. The paramedics said her glucose was dangerously low because she took too much insulin." I felt a stab of professional concern, but I resisted the urge to offer advice or intervention. This was exactly why diabetic patients needed qualified supervision, not well-meaning family members trying to manage complex medical conditions. "They hired a home health aide, but it's only for 2 hours in the morning," Janet continued. "The rest of the time, David is trying to manage her medications and blood sugar monitoring, but he's overwhelmed. He's 72 years old and never dealt with anything this complicated." The subtext was clear. Janet was hoping I would feel guilty enough to step in and solve the problem, but Uncle Tom's revelations about family patterns had inoculated me against this particular manipulation. "I'm sorry to hear she's struggling," I said carefully. "There are agencies that specialize in diabetes management if they need more comprehensive care." Janet paused, probably expecting a different response. "Well, professional care is very expensive. Most things worth having are," I replied. Over the following weeks, the consequences of inadequate care management became increasingly apparent. Through the hospital grapevine, I learned that Mom had been to the emergency room 3 more times for blood sugar-related crises. Each visit cost thousands of dollars and added to the family's mounting medical expenses. Meanwhile, Natalie's financial situation was deteriorating rapidly. Aunt Janet mentioned during one of our infrequent conversations that Natalie had taken a part-time job at Target to help cover expenses. The irony wasn't lost on me. Natalie, who had spent her adult life cultivating an image of effortless success through social media, was now working retail to help pay for the mother who had always favored her over the daughter with actual medical expertise. The strain was affecting her marriage, too. Jake, who had always seemed like a patient and supportive husband, was apparently reaching his limit with the financial pressure. Their mortgage payments were falling behind, and their credit card debt was accumulating faster than they could manage. At work, my colleagues began noticing positive changes in my demeanor and performance. The constant low-level stress that had characterized my interaction with my family was gone, replaced by a calm focus that improved everything from my patient care to my relationships with coworkers. Dr. Amy Walsh commented on the change during one of our lunch breaks. "You seem different, Hannah. More confident, less anxious. Whatever you're doing, it's working." I told her about my decision to maintain boundaries with my family's care expectations and Uncle Tom's revelations about generational patterns. Amy nodded approvingly. "I went through something similar 5 years ago with my own mother. The guilt was overwhelming at first, but cutting off toxic family dynamics was the best decision I ever made for my mental health." She leaned forward, her expression serious. "Family members love to weaponize medical training. They assume because you're a nurse you should provide unlimited free services. But professional boundaries exist for good reasons. Even Marcus Thompson noticed the improvement in my work performance. During my quarterly review, he mentioned that my productivity had increased significantly over the past few months, and that my interactions with patients and staff had become more positive and engaged. "There's a charge nurse position opening up in our cardiac ICU," he said. "I'd like you to consider applying. The role comes with additional responsibilities, but also a substantial salary increase." The promotion possibility felt like validation that setting boundaries had been the right choice. Instead of being drained by family obligations, I was thriving professionally and personally. But my family wasn't ready to accept my decision quietly. The confrontation I had been dreading finally occurred on a Tuesday afternoon during shift change. I was giving a report to the evening nurses when I heard raised voices from the lobby area. Through the ICU doors, I could see Natalie arguing with the security guard at the front desk. My heart sank as I realized she had come to my workplace to continue the pressure campaign. I excused myself from the report and walked to the lobby where Natalie was demanding to see me, despite being told that personal visits during work hours weren't permitted. "Hannah, thank God," she said when she spotted me. "I need to talk to you. It's about Mom." "Natalie, you can't be here. This is my workplace." She looked terrible. Her usually perfect appearance was disheveled, her designer clothes replaced with a Target employee uniform, and her face showed the strain of weeks of financial and emotional pressure. "Mom almost died yesterday," she said loudly enough for other staff members to hear. "She went into diabetic coma because David gave her the wrong medication. The doctor said if he hadn't found her when he did, she could have suffered permanent brain damage." Several colleagues were now watching our conversation with obvious concern. I felt my professional reputation being threatened by this public family drama. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said quietly, trying to keep my voice calm. "But you need to leave now. This isn't appropriate." "Appropriate?" Natalie's voice rose to near shouting. "What's not appropriate is abandoning your own mother when she's dying. What's not appropriate is having medical training and refusing to use it to save your family." That's when Marcus Thompson appeared, having heard the commotion from his office. He approached us with the kind of calm authority that came from years of managing hospital crises. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, looking between Natalie and me. "This is my sister," I explained. "She's upset about a family medical situation, but I've told her that personal visits aren't allowed during work hours." Marcus turned to Natalie with professional courtesy but unmistakable firmness. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to leave the premises. Hospital policy doesn't permit family disputes in patient care areas." "You don't understand," Natalie protested. "She's letting our mother die because she's too selfish to help with medical care." Marcus's expression hardened slightly. "Ma'am, I need you to leave immediately, or I'll have to call security to escort you out." Natalie looked between Marcus and me, perhaps finally realizing that her public confrontation was damaging my professional standing rather than achieving her goal of guilt-tripping me into compliance. "This isn't over, Hannah," she said as she turned to leave. "When Mom dies because you refuse to help, that's on you." After she left, Marcus asked me to come to his office. I was prepared for a reprimand about allowing personal drama to intrude into the workplace, but his response surprised me. "Do you want to talk about what just happened?" he asked gently. I explained the family situation briefly, focusing on the pressure to provide unpaid medical services and my decision to maintain professional boundaries. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "Hannah, you handled that situation exactly right. Family members who try to exploit medical training for free services are unfortunately common in healthcare. Your decision to set boundaries is professional and appropriate." He paused, then continued. "I'll document this incident with HR, but not as a negative mark against you. It's important to have a record in case this harassment continues." Walking back to the ICU, I felt a profound sense of validation. My supervisor, my colleagues, and the medical professionals I respected all supported my decision to maintain boundaries. The only people criticizing my choices were the ones who wanted to exploit my training for their financial benefit. For the first time since this crisis began, I felt completely certain that I was making the right choice. 2 years later, on a sunny Saturday afternoon in June 2027, I was walking through the produce section of my local Whole Foods when I spotted a familiar figure examining the organic strawberries. Aunt Janet looked older than her 54 years old, with more gray in her hair and deeper lines around her eyes, but she still carried herself with the same quiet dignity I remembered from childhood. She noticed me at the same moment, and her face lit up with genuine warmth. "Hannah." "What a pleasant surprise," she said, abandoning her shopping cart to give me a hug that felt more authentic than any family interaction I could remember. I had to admit, Janet looked good. The stress lines that had marked her face during the family crisis seemed to have softened, and there was a lightness about her that I hadn't seen before. "You look wonderful," she said, stepping back to study me. Truly happy. I was happy. The past 2 years had been transformative in ways I couldn't have imagined when I first walked out of Mom's wedding. I had been promoted to charge nurse in the cardiac ICU, a position that came with both increased responsibility and a salary of $85,000 a year. More importantly, I loved the work and felt valued by my colleagues in a way that my family had never made me feel. I had also started dating Michael Chen, a respiratory therapist I met during a particularly challenging case. He was kind, funny, and completely baffled by the idea of family members who treated medical professionals like unpaid servants. Our relationship was built on mutual respect and genuine affection concepts that felt revolutionary after a lifetime of conditional family love. My social circle had expanded too. Dr. Amy Walsh had become a close friend along with several other colleagues who had become my chosen family. We supported each other through professional challenges, celebrated successes together, and created the kind of loving community I had always thought existed only in other people's lives. "How are you doing?" I asked Janet as we moved our conversation away from the busy produce area. "I'm good," she said, then paused. "Actually, I'm better than I've been in years. Tom and I have been doing some soul-searching about family dynamics, and we've made some changes in our own lives." She looked around the store, then back at me. "Would you like to grab coffee? There are some things I'd like to tell you if you're interested." We found a quiet corner in the store's cafe area, and Janet settled in with her latte, looking more serious than her initial greeting had suggested. "I want to start by apologizing," she said without preamble. "Not just for the wedding situation, but for years of enabling your mother's behavior toward you. I saw what was happening, and I chose to stay neutral because it was easier than confronting her." The apology was unexpected but appreciated. I had long since made peace with Janet's initial lack of support, understanding that standing up to Mom required a level of courage that not everyone possessed. "You weren't responsible for Mom's choices," I said gently. "Maybe not," Janet replied, "but I was responsible for my own choices. And I chose silence when I should have spoken up for you." She took a sip of her coffee, then continued. "I've been visiting your mother at the memory care facility where she lives now. Her condition has deteriorated significantly over the past year. The diabetes complications combined with what appears to be early onset dementia have left her requiring round-the-clock specialized care. The facility costs $5,200 a month," Janet explained. "Between that and her other medical expenses, Natalie is working 3 different jobs trying to keep up with the costs. She's a server at 2 different restaurants in addition to her target shifts." I felt a flicker of sympathy for Natalie, but it was tempered by the memory of years of deliberate cruelty and exclusion. "Jake filed for divorce 6 months ago," Janet continued. "He cited financial stress and what he called toxic family dynamics in the paperwork. Natalie lost the house in Sugar Land and moved into a small apartment with Emma and Mason. The information was sad, but not surprising. The consequences of prioritizing image over substance, of building a life on financial instability and family manipulation, had finally caught up with my sister." "What's interesting," Janet said, her voice becoming more animated, "is how other family members have responded to watching this situation unfold. Several of our cousins have started questioning their own family obligations. 2 of them have set boundaries with demanding relatives after seeing how well you've thrived since cutting contact." This was news that actually pleased me. The idea that my decision to prioritize my own well-being might have inspired others to examine their own toxic family dynamics felt like an unexpected positive outcome. "Tom has been talking to them about generational patterns," Janet continued, "about how families can create cycles of exploitation that continue until someone is brave enough to break them." She reached across the table and briefly touched my hand. "You were that someone, Hannah. You broke the cycle, and it's had ripple effects throughout our extended family." As we finished our coffee and prepared to return to our separate shopping, Janet gave me another hug. "I want you to know that Tom and I are proud of you," she said quietly. "What you did took incredible strength, and you've built a beautiful life for yourself." Walking back to my car with my groceries, I reflected on how much had changed since that humiliating day at the wedding, when I stood in the corner like a fool, desperate for acceptance from people who had never intended to give it. I thought about the journey from that moment of public rejection to this afternoon's encounter with Janet. 2 years of therapy, professional growth, relationship building, and financial stability. 2 years of learning what it felt like to be valued and respected by people who chose to have me in their lives, rather than people who felt obligated to tolerate my presence. I had no regrets about my decision to cut contact with Mom and Natalie. No guilt about refusing to sacrifice my career and well-being to provide unpaid medical services. No sadness about missing family gatherings where I had always been treated as an afterthought. Instead, I felt profound gratitude for finally finding the courage to choose myself, to prioritize my own happiness and well-being over the impossible task of earning love from people who had decided long ago that I wasn't worth loving. The truth I had learned was both painful and liberating. Sometimes loving yourself means letting toxic family members go. Sometimes the healthiest choice is to stop trying to fix relationships that were broken by design. Sometimes the people who claim to love you are actually the ones preventing you from discovering what real love feels like. As I drove home to my peaceful apartment where Michael was cooking dinner, and we would spend the evening planning our upcoming vacation to Ireland, I realized that standing like a fool at that wedding had been the beginning of the best decision I ever made. I had finally learned the difference between being wanted and being needed, between family loyalty and family exploitation, between love and manipulation. And for the first time in my life, I was surrounded by people who actually wanted me there. If you've ever struggled with toxic family dynamics or felt pressured to sacrifice your well-being for people who don't value you, I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. Setting boundaries with family is one of the hardest things we can do, but sometimes it's the only way to save ourselves. And if this story resonated with your own experience, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories about overcoming family trauma and finding the courage to choose yourself.